The following program is a broadcast service of the Civil War Broadcasting Network. Permission to copy and/or distribute is granted, and indeed it's encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. This presentation is one of the ongoing series General Grant looks at the American Civil War. This particular presentation is Fort Donelson, the paperwork. There is an expression in armies that is as old as armies, that it isn't over until the paperwork is done. After action reports that are written immediately after a conflict by the commanding officers of both sides of a conflict are always informative. Sometimes they are interesting, and occasionally they are revelatory. I should like to review with you the after-action reports written very soon after the battle at Fort Donelson by myself, General Buckner, Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote. And I would also like to review with you the three very brief notes passed between General Buckner and myself regarding the surrender of Fort Donelson. On February the 16th, at probably about 2 o'clock in the morning, General Buckner sent this note through the lines to me. Headquarters, Fort Donelson, February the 16th, 1862. Sir, in consideration of all the circumstances governing the present situation of affairs at this station, I propose to the commanding officers of the federal forces the appointment of commissioners to agree upon terms of capitulation of the forces and the post under my command, and in that view suggest an armistice until about 12 o'clock today. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, S.B. Buckner, Brigadier General, C.S. Army, to Brigadier General U.S. Grant, commanding U.S. forces near Donelson. It didn't take long for me to compose this 2-sentence or 3-sentence reply to General Buckner. Headquarters, Army in the field, camp near Fort Donelson, February the 16th, 1862. Sir, yours of this date, proposing armistice and appointing of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation, is just received. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant, Brigadier General Commanding. To S.B. Buckner. General Buckner shortly replied, Sir, the distribution of forces under my command, incident to an unexpected change of commanders, and the overwhelming force under your command compel me, notwithstanding the brilliant success of the Confederate arms yesterday, to accept the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms which you propose. I am, sir, your very obedient servant, S.B. Buckner, Brigadier General, C.S. Army. General Buckner and I met later that morning, and he surrendered Fort Donelson and all Confederate forces to the U.S. forces. This is the after-action report that he wrote just 2 days after the battle at Fort Donelson. Dover, Tennessee, February 18, 1862. Headquarters, Cumberland Army. Sir, it becomes my duty to report that the remains of this army, after winning some brilliant successes both in repulsing the assaults of the enemy and in sallying successfully through their lines, have been reduced to the necessity of a surrender. At the earliest practicable day, I will send a detailed report of its operations. I can only say now that after the Battle of the 15th instant had been won and my division of the Army was being established in a position to cover the retreat of the Army, the plan of battle seemed to have been changed and the troops were ordered back to the trenches. Before my own division returned to their works on the extreme right, the lines were assaulted at that point, and my extreme right was occupied by a large force of the enemy, but I successfully repelled their assaults. It was the purpose of General Floyd to effect the retreat of the Army over the ground which had been won in the morning, and the troops moved from their works with that view. But before any movement for that purpose was organized, a reconnaissance showed that the ground was occupied by the enemy in great strength. General Floyd then determined to retreat across the river with such force as could escape. But as there were no boats until nearly daylight on the 16th, he left with some regiments of Virginia troops about daylight and was accompanied by Brigadier General Pillow. I was thus left in command of the remnant of the Army which had been placed in movement for a retreat which was discovered to be impracticable. My men were in a state of complete exhaustion, from extreme suffering from cold and fatigue. The supply of ammunition, especially for the artillery, was being rapidly exhausted, and the Army was to a great extent demoralized by the retrograde movement. On being placed in command, I ordered such troops as could not cross the river to return to their entrenchments, to make the last moment such resistance as was possible to the overwhelming force of the enemy. But a small portion of the forces had returned to the lines when I received from General Grant a reply to my proposal to negotiate for terms of surrender. To have refused his terms would, in the condition of the Army at that time, have led to the massacre of my troops without any advantage resulting from the sacrifice. I therefore felt it my highest duty to these brave men, whose conduct had been so brilliant and whose sufferings had been so intense, to accept the ungenerous terms proposed by the federal commander, who overcame us solely by overwhelming superiority of numbers. This Army is accordingly prisoners of war, the officers retaining their sidearms and private property, and the soldiers their clothing and blankets. I regret to state, however, that notwithstanding the earnest efforts of General Grant and many of his officers to prevent it, our camps have been a scene of almost indiscriminate pillage by the federal troops. In conclusion, I request at the earliest time practicable a court of inquiry to examine into the causes of the surrender of this Army. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, S.B. Buckner, Brigadier General, Confederate Army. Indeed, requesting as early as practicable a court of inquiry to look into the causes of the surrender of that fort. This is the report of Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote. I should like to praise the Navy and their sincere cooperation to every extent possible in the victory attained at Fort Donelson. But Flag Officer Foote submitted this report on the 14th, late on the 14th of February. Flagship St. Louis, near Fort Donelson, Cumberland River, February 15, 1862. Sir, I have the honor to report that, as you regarded the movement as a military necessity, although not, in my judgment, properly prepared, I made an attack on Fort Donelson yesterday, the 14th instant, at 3:00 p.m. with 4 ironclad and 2 wooden gunboats, the St. Louis, Carondelet, Louisville, and Pittsburgh, with the Tyler and Conestoga, and after a severe fight of an hour and a half, being in the latter part of the action less than 400 yards from the fort. The wheel of this vessel, by a shot through the pilot house, was carried away, and the tiller ropes of the Louisville also disabled by a shot, which rendered the two boats wholly unmanageable. They then drifted down the river, the relieving tackles not being able to steer or control them in the rapid current. The two remaining boats, the Pittsburgh and Carondelet, were also greatly damaged between wind and water, and soon followed us, as the enemy rapidly renewed the fire as we drifted helplessly down the river. This vessel, the St. Louis, alone received 59 shots, 4 between wind and water, and 1 in the pilot house, mortally wounding the pilot and others, requiring some time to put her in repair. There were 54 killed and wounded in the attack, which, notwithstanding our disadvantages, we have every reason to suppose that would in 15 minutes more, could the action have been continued, have resulted in the capture of the two forts bearing upon us, as the enemy's fire materially slackened, and he was running from his batteries when the two gunboats helplessly drifted down the river from disabled steering apparatus, as the relieving tackles could not control the helm in the strong current. When the fleeing enemy returned to their guns and again boldly reopened the fire upon us from the river battery, which we had silenced. The enemy must have brought over 20 heavy guns to bear upon our boats from the water batteries and the main fort on the side of the hill, which, while we could only return the fire with 12 bow guns from the 4 boats. 1 rifled gun aboard the Carondelet burst during the action. The officers and men in this hotly contested but unequal fight behaved with the greatest gallantry and enthusiasm, all deploring the accident rendering 2 gunboats suddenly helpless in the narrow river and swift current. On consultation with General Grant and my own officers as my services here until we can repair damages by bringing up a competent force from Cairo to attack the fort, are much less required than they are at Cairo. I shall proceed to that point with 2 of the disabled boats, leaving the 2 others here to protect the transports, and with all dispatch prepare the mortar boats and Benton with other boats to make an effectual attack upon Fort Donelson. I have sent the Tyler to the Tennessee River to render impassable the bridge so as to prevent the rebels at Columbus reinforcing their army at Donelson. I transmit herewith a list of casualties. I am informed that the rebels were served with the best gunners from Columbus. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, A.H. Foote, Flag Officer, Commanding U.S. Naval Forces on the Western Waters. 2. Major General Halleck, Commanding Army of the West, St. Louis, Missouri. This is the report I sent to the Chief of Staff, General George W. Cullom, in St. Louis immediately after the surrender. Headquarters, Army in the Field, Fort Donelson, February 16, 1862. General G. W. Cullom, Chief of Staff, Department of the Missouri. General, I am pleased to announce to you the unconditional surrender this morning of Fort Donelson with 12 to 15,000 prisoners, at least 40 pieces of artillery, and a large amount of stores, horses, mules, and other public property. I left Fort Henry on the 12th instant with a force of about 15,000 men, divided into 2 divisions under the commands of General McClernand and General Smith. 6 regiments were sent around by water the day before, convoyed by a gunboat, or rather, started one day later than one of the gunboats with instructions not to pass it. The troops made the march in good order, the head of the column arriving within 2 miles of the fort at 12 o'clock midday. At this point, the enemy's pickets were met and driven in. The fortifications of the enemy were from this point gradually approached and surrounded with occasional skirmishing on the line. The following day, owing to the non-arrival of the gunboats and reinforcements sent by water, no attack was made, but the investment was extended on the flanks of the enemy and drawn closer to his works, with skirmishing all day. The evening of the 13th, the gunboats and reinforcements arrived. On the 14th, a gallant attack was made by Flag Officer Foote upon the enemy's works with his fleet. The engagement lasted probably 1 hour and a half and bid fair to result favorably to the cause of the Union, when 2 unlucky shots disabled 2 of the armored boats so that they were carried back by the tide. The remaining 2 were very much disabled, also having received a number of heavy shots about the pilot houses and other parts of the vessels. After these mishaps, I concluded to make the investment of Fort Donelson as perfect as possible and partially fortify and await repairs to the gunboats. This plan was frustrated, however, by the enemy making a most vigorous attack upon our right wing, commanded by General J.A. McClernand, with a portion of the force under General Lew Wallace. The enemy were repelled after a closely contested battle of several hours, in which our loss was heavy. The officers, in particular field officers, suffered out of proportion. I have not the means yet of determining our loss even approximately, but it cannot fall far short of 1,200 killed, wounded, and missing. Of the latter, I understand, though, General Buckner, about 250 were taken prisoners. I shall retain enough of the enemy to exchange for them, as they were immediately shipped off and not left for recapture. About the close of this action, the ammunition in cartridge boxes gave out, which, with the loss of many of the field officers, produced great confusion in the ranks. Seeing that the enemy did not take advantage of it, convinced me that equal confusion and possibly great demoralization existed with him. Taking advantage of this fact, I ordered a charge upon the left, the enemy's right, with the division under General C.F. Smith, which was most brilliantly executed, and gave to our arms full assurance of victory. The battle lasted until dark, giving us possession of part of the entrenchments. An attack was ordered from the other flank after the charge by General Smith was commenced by the divisions under Generals McClernand and Wallace, which, notwithstanding the hours of exposure to a heavy fire in the fore part of the day, was gallantly made and the enemy further repulsed. At the points gained, night having come on, all the troops encamped for the night, feeling that a complete victory would crown their labors at an early hour in the morning. This morning, at a very early hour, a note was received from General S.B. Buckner under a flag of truce proposing an armistice, etc. A copy of the correspondence which ensued is herewith accompanying. I cannot mention individuals who specifically distinguished themselves, but leave that to division and brigade commanders, whose reports will be forwarded as soon as received. To division commanders, however, Generals McClernand, Smith, and Wallace, I must do justice to say that each of them were with their commands in the midst of danger and were always ready to execute all orders, no matter what the exposure to themselves. At the hour the attack was made on General McClernand's command, I was absent, having received a note from Flag Officer Foote requesting me to go and see him, he being unable to call in consequence of a wound received the day before. My personal staff, Colonel J.T. Webster, Chief of Staff, Colonel J. Riggin, Volunteer Aide, Captain J.A. Rawlins, Assistant Adjutant General, Captains C.B. Lago and W.S. Hillier, Aides, Lieutenant Colonel J.B. McPherson, Chief Engineer, are all deserving of personal mention for their gallantry and services. For full details, see reports of engineers, medical director, and commanders of brigades and divisions to follow. I am General, very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant, Brigadier General. Those are the after-action reports written immediately after the Battle of Fort Donelson, which was a significant Union victory. It was the largest number of prisoners ever captured in a surrender on this continent to date. But that is enough for this coming together and reflecting and reviewing the paperwork of Fort Donelson. I bid you an affectionate adieu.